A bull reared between sun and dust, hooves striking the packed earth like thunder, and a white bonnet flew from a mother's lap as if it had surrendered to the sky. Clara Winslow's hand closed on nothing but air. For the space of one long breath, the world was all motion and noise, shouts, the whip-crack of a rope, children crying. Then a man appeared through the chaos, riding with a certainty that did not belong to the fairgrounds. Rowan Hail saw the child first. A tiny bundle of blanket and limbs toppled toward the low rail of the stands. June, no more than a year and a half, slipped from the press of woman's skirts and the spread of frightened hands. The bull, freed from its lead, turned like a weathered boulder, hooves scraping, eyes wild with the smell of terror and the suddenness of space. People scattered. Boards creaked. The sun cut the day into hot, bright plains and deep shadowed lines. Rowan moved before thought finished its work. Habit more than heroics, muscle memory honed by years in the open. He dropped from his saddle at speed and ran, boots knocking the earth, a hand on the rail, a body between beast and child. He slid along the crowd's edge, elbowing past a man clinging to his hat, a woman stumbling over her skirt. The bull's flank was a moving wall of muscle. Its charge sent a ripple through the row of benches. Rowan felt the draft of its passing, like the warning of a storm. He reached the fallen bundle, scooped it up, small, hot, crying, and turned, only to find the animal between him and the way out. People yelled. Someone pushed a shawl toward the animal. Someone else threw a hat to distract. Rowan shifted his weight, flattened himself, and when the bull lunged, he became something it could not read, calm in the middle of madness. He stepped toward it with open hands, not making a run for the edge, but occupying the space the beast expected to be empty. Hooves crashed a breath away. The crowd gasped. Then, by a motion that would become a private story for two, the bull diverted, perhaps fooled, perhaps simply unwilling to touch the strange, steady figure, and Rowan broke for the fence, holding June to his chest as if she were already his own. He set the child into Clara's arms, with fingers that trembled more from the effort not to be shaken than from fear. Clara's face was white and struck with a look like someone waking from a fevered sleep. Her hand closed around June as if locking down a treasure. Around them, the fair went on as if it had learned to live with sudden calamity. Men corralled the bull. Someone mopped at a man's elbow with a flour sack. A child asked a neighbor about the lost bonnet, with a voice that was more curious than afraid. Clara looked up at Rowan with eyes that were part accusation and part gratitude, a complexity that softened him more than any thanks could have. "You could have been trampled," she said, though her hands did not leave June's back. Rowan's reply was a low sound somewhere between a laugh and a breath. Needed to be done. A woman pressed forward from the crowd, Maggie Duncan, apron chalked with flour and dust. Her face set itself into the business of care. "Take 'em to my wagon," she said to Rowan. "Mother'll see to the child and stitch up that cut. The marshal can look to the rest." Rowan hesitated. The fairgrounds were a miles-wide place for gossip and judging. He had no wish to be examined. But Clara's jaw had gone hard and protectively small, and there was no way he would move and leave the baby to the press of hands. He followed Maggie to the wagon with the casual gait of a man who moves at others' pace out of habit. Santos, who had ridden with him that morning and watched from a low ridge, fell into step by his side, steady and unspeaking. At the wagon, blankets thick with straw muffled June's wails into hiccups. Maggie poured tea into a tin cup and offered it to Clara, who refused and then accepted with the single, pragmatic motion of a woman whose decisions are made by need, not ceremony. A small cut tethered to Clara's brow, a sliver of blood on her cheek, where she must have struck the rail in grabbing at the child. Maggie stitched it with a sure hand, chatting about sales at the market and the price of barley, keeping her voice homely until it anchored them back to the ordinary world. Rowan watched Clara hold June the way one watches a light through rain. There was a carefulness to her that matched his own. He had been a loner for years, a man who chose solitude like a spare coat. Yet the sight of that child in a stranger's arms loosened something in him he had thought immovable. Perhaps it was the old grief. Perhaps it was simply that for the first time since the river took his family, he had been able to move through danger without the world pinning him with regret. Maggie nudged him. "You done all right there, Rowan. Folks talk." He shrugged, looking away. "Just did what needed to be done." Thomas Duncan, Maggie's husband, a solid man with hands like planks, offered him a cup. "Law'll be along. Marshal Briggs keeps a ledger." Rowan met Clara's gaze only briefly. "Where you headed?" he asked. Clara's answer was the kind built out of a life of making do. "Back to the homestead. We were in town for the fair. June hasn't been away from home much." "You shouldn't travel alone," Rowan said. Unbidden, the sound in his voice carried the kind of authority that encountered no argument. It was not a command so much as a proposition offered as a fact. Clara smiled faintly, the shape of someone well practiced at refusing refuge. When a woman has land to tend, she takes care of herself. Santos's voice cut through, pragmatic and low. "If you'd take shelter for a spell, there's space at the Hail Ranch. Little ones need rest, and stitches aren't proper in dirt." Clara studied him for a long moment. The deciding look was not for her own comfort so much as for June's steadiness. "All right, thank you, if only for the night." Rowan felt the small lift of hope like the beginning of a breath. He did not know whether it was his place to offer welcome, merely that it felt right. The ride back to his ranch carried the hush of aftershock. Horses quieter, the wind moving as if it too had been startled. They rode without much talk. Clara held June in her lap, the child's eyes heavy-handed with sleep. The bonnet had been found behind a bench, trampled but intact, and the sight of it tugged at something in Rowan he could not name without thinking of a riverbank and a small hand slipping. The ranch welcomed them without pretense. A wide porch, a stack of cordwood, a lantern that threw a warm plate of light. Santos led Clara to a room with fresh linens, while Rowan went to tack and water the horse. The house smelled of broth and soot, of mended leather, and the quiet use of a place. It's the smells of places lived in, the marks of hands and time. Clara sat at Rowan's kitchen table while Santos fussed with a steaming bowl. June slept, curled small against her chest. Light leaked through the open window and made the dust motes a slow constellation. Rowan couldn't help but watch the way Clara's thumb traced a line across June's forehead as if it were a map of careful routes. He moved to pour tea and found himself standing too near. Their conversation began in fragments. Names, where she had come from, the small litany of necessities people use to gauge each other's trust. He learned that Clara's husband had died 2 years before, taken by a fever that rolled through their valley when the winter turned cruel. She'd kept the homestead for the sake of something sturdy. The spring that bubbled behind Maggie's place, the tilt of the land, a fence line passed down by a father with a back like a plank. June had come into the world in a poor room lit by candle and called victory each day. Clara had been practical, fierce where needed, soft in private. She mended shirts, bartered eggs for cloth, watched the horizon more than anyone else in that valley. Her life was a small craft of survival, a careful geometry of chores and plans. Rowan told a smaller piece of himself. He let the river tell it. He spoke of a late spring when water rose with sudden hunger, and he had ridden to save a child, his child, and failed. The memory came with the shape of sound, water lashing, a plank ringing with impact, the small weight of a hand slipping. He never used the name of the one he'd lost. It remained a thing he never asked the heir to return. He spoke of his leaving town after it happened, of the way silence becomes company. Saying the facts aloud did not lessen them, but placing them on the table made them common goods instead of a private burning coal. Clara listened as people do when listening means beginning to understand why another person moves through the world as he does. She did not pity him. There was no sentimentality in her. Instead, there was a recognition, like finding a kindred method in how he folded hay or how he kept a watch at night. Grief teaches you to be quick with a hand, she said once, faster than feelings sometimes. They shared supper in a quiet room. The conversation folded into the sound of a kettle and the soft night. Rowan mended a tear in June's blanket without being asked, his fingers sure. Clara watched him for a long time, and then, before sleep took her, she said, "You saved her, Mr. Hail. You don't know what that did." He looked at her, feeling the thing in his ribs shift like an old tool finding its place. "Maybe I do," he said simply. Word travels on a valley wind. News of the rescue sparked 100 small endorsements and a rumor or two. At church the next Sunday, men nodded at Rowan in ways that measured approval and a new kind of expectation. The story of the bull and the man who had walked into its path became a parable the size of the valley for a week. More importantly, it introduced Clara and June to a community that had been leaning towards solitude as much as they had. People offered help in the discreet way communities do. Figs for the winter, a favor here, a small job there. There were hands extended in practical ways. Clara accepted some and refused others with equal kindness. But the valley had other noises beneath its pastoral surface. The summer had been dry. Fences sagged, streams thinned to shallows, and the question of water, always the valley's quiet currency, rose like smoke. Dawson Consincade watched from his horse. He had a ranch that filled a horizon and a way of looking that measured land in barbs. His holdings had expanded into a patchwork that ate at the borders of other people's claims. When the spring by Maggie Duncan's fence ran thin, Dawson came with his ledger and his hard jaw. His son, Garrett, a man with a sharp mouth and the appetite to match, rode through the market with the imperious air of entitlement. He asked after Clara in a manner that was more an inspection than a greeting. "You do well to sell," he told Maggie, when he could not find a use for subterfuge. "You could buy higher ground. The Consincade herds need water, and we can pay more than small change for anyone wanting to move." Maggie laughed in a way that was not for humor. "We don't sell our bones so anyone can fatten their herds," she said. Rowan watched him from the livery, a slow burn of irritation in his chest. He did not like men who measured land only by weight and money. He did not like the way Garrett's eyes assessed people as though they were ledgers themselves. But Garrett's threats were veiled in market talk, and the law still had teeth in this territory. There would be no open declaration of war. Not yet. The first sign that words alone would not suffice came as a charred beam found in the Duncans' back field one morning. Someone had set a small outbuilding alight in the early dark when the Duncans preferred to sleep with the doors latched and the dogs quiet. The fire had been small enough not to consume the barn, but deliberate enough to leave a message. Sparks landed among straw, and a note was nailed to a post. Leave, or worse would come. Fear, in a valley used to being sensible, spread like salt water. Men gathered for a meeting in Thomas Duncan's barn. The air was thick with dust and the smell of sweat. Thomas, a man used to making hard choices, laid out the plain facts. If they get the spring, half the valley dries with it, he said. If they push until folks leave, they'll take fences, sweep up land. We don't have many ways to fight that but one: speak in a way the law hears. Marshal Briggs, broad of shoulder and slow of laugh, listened with the patience of someone who had watched disputes settle and argued. "You gather testimony," he said. "You show you held water use in good faith. You show the damage. We'll file claim." But law moves slow, and a man with money can press harder in the meantime. Rowan spoke then. He did not seek to inflame. He spoke with the kind of clarity that made people listen. "We will catalog what they've done," he said. "We keep watch at night. We catch them in act, and we turn 'em over to Briggs. No taking of vengeance. We do it straight." Not everyone liked that. A younger man accused of cowardice or caution. Another asked whether they ought to teach them a lesson. But the consensus held: use the law as their spear and the community as their shield. They organized watches, 2 men on a shift, a cup of black coffee handed over a fence in the dark, the position taken by sightlines near the spring. Rowing himself into an organizer's task felt odd, but he found comfort in the practical: a plan, a roster, a place to stand. Clara volunteered to help in a way that surprised no one who had watched her. She made sure the watchers had clean shirts and a warm stew to bring on cold nights. She sewed extra pouches to hold flints and matched the stitching to the hands that would use them. In doing so, she knitted herself into the fabric of a fight she had not asked for but understood. Her resolve was quiet and firm. She did not want violence. She wanted safety for June and for the small, stubborn land that anchored her. Rowan spoke then. He did not seek to inflame. He spoke with the kind of clarity that made people listen. "We will catalog what they've done," he said. "We keep watch at night. We catch them in act, and we turn 'em over to Briggs. No taking of vengeance. We do it straight." Not everyone liked that. A younger man accused of cowardice or caution. Another asked whether they ought to teach them a lesson. But the consensus held: use the law as their spear and the community as their shield. They organized watches, 2 men on a shift, a cup of black coffee handed over a fence in the dark, the position taken by sightlines near the spring. Rowing himself into an organizer's task felt odd, but he found comfort in the practical: a plan, a roster, a place to stand. Clara volunteered to help in a way that surprised no one who had watched her. She made sure the watchers had clean shirts and a warm stew to bring on cold nights. She sewed extra pouches to hold flints and matched the stitching to the hands that would use them. In doing so, she knitted herself into the fabric of a fight she had not asked for but understood. Her resolve was quiet and firm. She did not want violence. She wanted safety for June and for the small, stubborn land that anchored her. Santos and Rowan rode the ridge on more than one night, watching the scattering of lanterns below, the hush of settled animals. They listened for the shift in the wind, or the stray clink that told a man was moving where he had no right. Once, a rider flitted back and forth near the edge of Dawson's claim in a way that suggested scouting. Once, a man tried to buy a cow with paper that smelled of money. Each time they collected a small, sharp fact and wrote it on a ledger to present to Briggs later. The law would be their long-armed net. Until then, the valley would hold tight. Dawson's motives were not simple greed. His ranch had been hurt by cattle disease the year before. A run of bad winters had left debts to be repaid. Water meant the difference between survival and surrender for his herd. He had a temperament that turned private anxiety into public pressure. Garrett, younger and given to swift hands, provided the muscle. Dawson provided the ledger and the cold justification. It did not excuse arson or threats. It made them human enough to be dangerous in a different way, men with reason who had chosen force. Rowan found his nights growing shorter. He rose with the dawn and did what the work required, but his mind was often in the dark. He repaired a fence that had sagged, spoke briefly with the marshal about affidavits, drove stakes in the ground for watchmen to meet. Clara came by the ranch more often than comfort demanded. She would bring a pie no one asked for, a jar of hand-picked preserves, the sort of domestic kindness that anchors a man to the land more effectively than words of gratitude. She mended shirts, braided a rope, and in quiet moments would watch Rowan work until his jaw eased like a trap relieving its catch. One morning at the market, Garrett Consincade followed Clara to the stall where she bartered for thread. He towered there, his voice a dry thing. "Seems you've made friends at Hale's place," he said. "Be careful whom you invite in. Not every man with a saddle is a man you want at your table." Clara turned and met him with an economy of gesture. "I have more than one man at my table already," she said, "and I don't take advice on hospitality from strangers." The market's air held an edge after that. People pretended not to listen, but ears are good at catching the flavor of things. Rowan, who had been a ways off, heard the exchange. He stepped between Clara and Garrett with a natural spacing that said respect for boundaries belonged to both parties. Garrett sniffed, insulted, and rode off. The exchange might have been a spice of bad manners at any other time, but the valley tasted old threats in it. That evening, a young neighbor, Bill Weatherby, came with a tale. He'd seen a group of men smoke near the edge of Maggie's property, men who did not belong. They had maps, he said, and a small plan to put a scare into homesteaders. The mention of maps made the marrow in Rowan's bones cold. It meant strategy and resources. It meant that Dawson was using means beyond drunken threats. It meant the valley would need to be smarter. They taught Clara how to recognize the quiet signs: a boot print too fresh on the lane, a horse feed dish wiped clean as if to hide scent, the quick closing of shutters when a rider passed. She learned a new vigilance, the way parents do when teaching children to cross a road. It did not deliver her from fear, but it armed her with knowledge and a place inside the valley's defense. Rowan saw her build herself anew into a woman who could care for a child and keep a watch at a fence. Each stitch Clara made, each meal she set out, knitted her closer to him in ways neither of them spoke. The watch roster swelled as other neighbors took their shifts. Cooper, a man with an old dog and a dry laugh. A teacher who kept school at the little frame house and lent a lamp when it was needed. Even a young blacksmith who had never rode with the older hands before. They traded stories between watches to keep fatigue at bay, some about storms, others about better days. The lawman's presence bolstered them. Marshal Briggs visited and took down names and particulars. He did not promise miracles. His way was methodical and slow, but he believed in the weight of many witnesses. "Bring me the stories," he said. "Bring me dates, names, damages. The court likes things in order." Once, under a crescent moon, they discovered a set of tracks that led not from the road, but from Dawson's direction. The prints were fresh and purposeful. They followed them to find toasted straw and a cigarette butt crushed into the dirt. It was the smallest of things, but it carried the meaning of an approach. They documented it, took photographs with a lamp and sketches by hand, and wrote the fact into an affidavit. Marshal Briggs nodded and said, "We'll have what we need someday. For now, you watch." Rowan found himself thinking of June more than usual. He had never meant to be a father. The title of the thing was heavy and awkward. Yet when he watched Clara kneel to set a clacker into the child's hand, or when he saw the way she smoothed a napkin across tiny knees, he felt something thaw. It was not love as in a song, not yet. It was the slow, plain gathering of a life made up of the same tasks and small mercies as everyone else. News came then, quiet as a rumor but sharp as a blade, that Garrett had been seen rounding up men for a night job. the world narrowed in on the valley. Men who had been warm with each other over stew found a silence between their words. They began to talk of contingencies. No one wished for bloodshed. No one wanted to be the sort of people who traded in it. Still, when fear is present, resolve becomes a muscle to be exercised. A week after the charred beam, a rider arrived at Rowan's gate with a handkerchief of clean linen and a message from Maggie. They planned to make a statement. Be ready. The note was plain. It could have meant any number of things. They prepared. That night, the valley breathed as one. Lamps were set in obvious places so passing riders would know they'd been seen. Dogs were walked through yard and lane not as sentries but as witnesses. People stayed close to houses. Clara sat with June at her knee, while the children of the valley slept in beds that felt smaller than before. Rowan walked the perimeter twice, the lamplight catching at his jaw, the memory of the river occasionally surfacing like a beast he'd learned to live beside. He found Clara on the porch when he returned from a circuit. She stood with her hands folded, the light behind her making the outline of her face as if in a painting. June slept against her shoulder, a thin weight that made Rowan's chest lurch with something he could not name, but recognized as having the same shape as protectiveness. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. She looked at him then, and the tiredness in her face rearranged into a line of fierce, intimate truth. "I won't," she said. "We watch. We hold fast. We make the law do its work." Rowan nodded. He laughed once, small and tired. "We tried to keep the valley stubborn." They set a plan that was not about triumph so much as endurance. The next days would be tests, of will, of the law, of their capacity to stand beside one another when time pressed like a hand. As the stars wheeled over the ridge that night, the valley hummed with the sound of small things, a lantern swinging, the murmur of voices in distant porches, the occasional thud of a hoof in the road. Rowan felt the old grief in him like a shadow at noon, and yet also something else that felt like a promise being made out of ordinary acts. On the dawn before what might become the night of reckoning, Clara slid from bed and fed June while the house still breathed sleep. She wrapped the child's blanket tight, smoothed hair from a sleeping brow, and tucked a small cloth into her pocket, an amulet of practical kindness. She stepped outside to the porch to see the valley wash in light, and Rowan was there with coffee that warmed his hands. They spoke little. Words would make promises too big for Dawn. Instead, Rowan handed her the coffee. She accepted it as if it were a pact. He did not press her to stay, nor did she ask him to leave. They crouched on the edge of something fragile and waited for whatever would come with the patience of people who had learned to bear more than they expected. In the yard, a horse pawed at the ground. The day smelled of dust and hot metal. Somewhere in the distance, the rhythm of men doing ordinary labor sounded like a lullaby that refused to be frightened. But the knowledge that men with maps and ledgers were loitering beyond the valley laid a new weight on every ordinary act. Milking cows, mending fences, teaching children to read. There was no victory yet, only the slow accumulation of proof and presence. Rowan watched Clara as she tucked June back into her blanket and thought of how quickly things could be taken by shove and claim. He had steered a bull away from a child. He had done 1,000 smaller rescues since the river took what mattered to him. Tonight, perhaps, he would do more. He would not be first to seek blood. He would not ask for triumph. But he would stand so that Clara and the valley could do what they must: hold fast, speak truth, and call the law to account. As the sun climbed, The valley pulled itself together like a living thing, adjusting to a shadow. People spoke in low voices, and hands moved with the economy of practice. Children were kept inside. Gates were latched. A hush lay over the ridge, the sort that prepares itself either for storm or harvest. It was impossible to tell which. When Marshal Briggs rode in that afternoon, his face was steady as the ledger he kept. He had cross-examinations in his pocket and patience at his back. He dismounted, tied his horse, and looked at the faces around him with the judge's blunt compassion. "We will take the names of those willing to swear to what they've seen," he said. "We'll draw up witness statements. We'll file the claim. But you must be prepared to watch and to wait. I can't move faster than proof and the law, but once the court hears enough, it acts." The word act fell between them like a small bell. It meant slow wheels put in motion, the authority of paper and oath, the possibility of consequence that outlived the easy money of a threatened man. It was a hope tempered with the knowledge of time. As the men and women left the gathering, some to tend cows, others to watch fences, Rowan lingered. Clara came up beside him and, without a word, slipped her hand into his. It was a small, intimate move that held more meaning than any declaration. Their fingers fit together with the ease of two tools that, by a strange grace, had been made to serve common work. They stood for a while, watching the sun shift over the fields. At the edge of the valley, beyond which fields softened into fallow land, a ridgeline cut the sky. On that line, men were gathering, riders who meant to shove and test. Rowan tightened his grip on Clara's hand and felt an answering squeeze that was not just comfort, but a joining of intent. The day darkened in the lower west, a cloud bank rolling like sound. The valley braced, small things moved into place, and men prepared for the night that might decide the course of many lives. Rowan readied his gear, served a bowl of stew to a neighbor who'd come to watch, and looked at the home he'd come to hold for reasons beyond logic. Clara fed June a little and tied her hair back for work. Santos checked his rifle with the steady gaze of a man who knows his tools and his obligations. No one wished for the violence rumor promised. No one wanted a night of blood. But they were willing to stand, to be witnesses, to let the law do what it must when it could. The standing was a kind of love for land, for child, for neighbor, that would not yield to the ledger or the ledger's owner. In that gentle defiance lay a fragile kind of courage. As dusk fell, Marian across the lane called out that she had seen a rider moving too close to the Duncan spring. Men took up positions. Dogs, restless all day, found places and whined softly. The valley stretched itself thin like the skin of a drum, listening for the first beat. Rowan felt the old grief press against his ribs, and learned that grief and resolve could share the same space. Clara wiped her hands, tucked June in with a care that was the shape of a promise, and lifted her chin as the first dark came on. She did not know how to fight with fists, but she knew how to fight with stubbornness and law and the simple act of staying. They were not heroes. They were not crusaders. They were neighbors with a small, fierce love for their world. The night to come would test more than courage. It would test their capacity to keep to law, to hold each other, and to let the valley's voice be louder than the clamor of a man with a ledger. They stood ready, and beyond their lines, under the same sky, a party of riders rode close enough to hear the watchdog bark. If the valley held its breath that night, the breath broke in a dozen small noises. A dog's snarl, a loose shutter banging, the single low cough of a man who had chosen the wrong road. Rowan's feet were firm on the porch, the wood under his boots as familiar as an old promise. He had the weight of a rifle across his knees, but kept it more as a comfort than a plan for harm. The watch had its orders: see the men, mark them, call the law. The whole point was to make the law possible. When the riders crested the rise, they moved with an economy that told of practice. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies at their saddles, and one voice, sharp and too loud, gave a command that was meant to scatter the little constellations of lamps in the valley. Garrett led them, his silhouette a notch of anger against the rim of sky. He rode with a certainty that had been bought and sharpened in the stables of privilege. People like him assumed obedience or payment in place of respect. They split into two parties. One party went for the Duncan spring house, likely the aim to make a spectacle, to cut the valve small and hush the passage of water. The other moved toward Maggie's outbuildings, where straw and feed waited. Their plan, it seemed, was not to kill, but to terrorize, the kind of violence that leaves a message rather than a body. That did not make it less dangerous. Fear, when it moves through a valley, makes neat work of the seams people have sown by habit. Rowan's watch signaled. A lantern was covertly raised near the lane where the riders would pass, and then every light in the opposite direction flared to life. Dogs barked on cue. The men made no sudden motions. They were a field of patient objects waiting for men who would soon reveal themselves. When the first rider saw the lamps and the dogs and the faces behind shutters, surprise cracked his composure like thin ice. Horses balked. The stranger's plan relied on stealth and terror. It could not stand the chorus of an awake valley. Garrett cursed and kicked his horse. He shouted for the men to push through, but the watch had learned how to blunt a shove with something more useful than fists: presence. The watchers moved with ropes and lanterns rather than bullets. Their faces were lit and firm. Their voices named names. "You're on private land," Bill Weatherby called out. "Marshall's got his eye on you," someone else shouted. That last shout bought them a moment, because the name of the law still carried weight. A man from Garrett's party tried to throw a torch toward Maggie's barn. It arced like an angry star, then was swallowed by the wind. Somebody, not Rowan, not at first, tossed a blanket over a nearby stack of hay to smother the ember. The torch fell to the dirt with an impotent hiss. Rowan moved the way a man does who has practiced restraint. Quick hands, decisive steps, a voice that did not invite a fight but refused a lie. He stepped between the rider and the barn when Garrett tried to spur forward. "This ends tonight," he said plainly. "You take a step more and you'll be speaking to Briggs." Garrett drew his reins with a laugh that was never meant to be humor. "Or what? You'll take my horse?" He nudged his mount forward as if to show the bluff that money gives. Rowan's answer was not a gun or a show of force. He unhooked a lariat from his saddle and walked forward with the strange calm of someone who meant to bind, not break. A rope loop catches the imagination differently than a drawn pistol. It transforms a threat into a chore that must be done in public and under witnesses. We bind you until Briggs gets here. No blood. That's the plan. Garrett's jaw clenched. He looked at his men, and the rider nearest him gave a single, resigned shake, as if he were turning a coin and finding it spent. Packs rustled, horses shifted. The rider behind Garrett, a man whose face the valley had not seen before, reached for his belt as if to draw, and then another man from the watch put an easy hand on his wrist and named him by the name he'd given at the feed store 2 weeks prior. People remembered faces. There were flared threats. Words had been the first weapons. But when a man found himself bound with a rope in the light of his neighbors, and Sarah Weatherby's lantern showed his sneer plainly, the charade of power began to unspool. Garrett's advantage had been in the dark and in the ledger. Both walked away when the ledger's hand could not find a footing among so many witnesses. They tied him to a fence post, not as a punishment, but as a gesture of custody. The men took photographs, simple sketches, and a whispered list of names, and one of the neighbors, the schoolteacher, ran to bring Mrs. Dixon's Bible for a solemn, frontier-style oath that the marshal would accept. The ritual was not drama, it was method. People swore what they had seen: tracks in the mud, the smell of smoke, a man they recognized. Marshal Briggs, when he arrived with the slow certainty of law, found the valley ready with ledger and testimony and restrained captors. The law moved. It moved as the marshal's boots clicked, and as the judge's writ would later be drawn. It moved in affidavits written by shaky hands and then read aloud and recorded. Garrett was taken into custody in a way that made his threats less relevant. Dawson's men, scattered and under watch, found the appetite of legal consequence more chilling than any threat Rowan might have offered. Still, even arrested, Garrett's rage did not vanish. He spit words at the watchers and at Rowan. "This'll cost you," he promised. "You'll see a day you wish you'd sold for what I offered." Rowan, who had learned to answer threats with steadiness, looked at the young man and said nothing. The words would become evidence. Anger spoken into the valley's ears would return home in court as admission. The watchers had done what they had sworn to do: keep the peace until the law could take hold. They had not killed anyone. They had not let vengeance rout them. They had made the valley's voice audible. The next days were the slow work of proof. Marshal Briggs moved with the pace of a man who believes in ladders, one rung at a time. He took depositions. He recorded the burned beam, the torch, the footprints that matched a shoe sold at Consincade's stable 2 months prior. Dawson's lawyer, a man in a city coat who smelled faintly of ink and the certainty of ledger lines, argued technicalities. He tried to narrow the case, to suggest isolated men had acted rogue, unconnected to the Consincade holdings. That was the move of a legal mind accustomed to seeing facts as things to be trimmed. But the strength of the Valley's case was not a single testimonial, but the chorus of them. Maggie's account of light and smoke and a brand on a boot. Thomas Duncan's ledger of the spring's water rights, whose margin had been signed by ancestors. Clara's affidavit, written with a hand that left the slight tremor of a woman who had held a sleeping child through a brush with loss. Rowan added his own, a man who'd seen tracks in Dawson's direction and had confronted a band that came with maps. The law takes time, but it listens where many mouths speak the truth. Dawson, forced into answer, found himself paying a different price than he had meant. A judge of the territory, stern, bearded, and used to numbers of cattle and the shape of watersheds, held a hearing in the town's assembly room. The courtroom filled with the valley-turned witness, cooper and teacher, baker and seamstress, each rendering a small fact that put together formed the picture of intimidation. The judge hammered a simple point. One cannot seize water by fear and leave the law's purse empty. Dawson's counsel pursued technicalities, but even technicalities fell short against the tide of neighborly truth. In the end, the court granted an injunction that legally protected the spring and fined several of the men who had been part of the raid. The sum did not break Dawson financially. He was still a man of means, but it cut into the margin he had been pressing on. More damaging to him was the court's censure, recorded and read in no uncertain terms. Intimidation and arson were not acceptable modes of property dispute. Reputation, in a place like that, is currency. Garrett faced stiffer consequences. His part in the night's work, documented, sworn to, left him liable not merely for fines, but for restitution and a short term in the custody of the territory's marshal. He left with his head down, a man made small by the ledger and by the stitchwork of communal resolve. None of this was dramatic. No tall gavel came down like a bolt of lightning. The law's victories in a place like the valley were more like a tide that ebbed for those who had once thought themselves islands, slow and unavoidable. The important detail was not that men paid fines, but that the valley had turned its small, steady power into a legal instrument that made intimidation less profitable. There was no thunderous overthrow. There was a patient application of rules that did more to hold people than any single sword might have. After the court's decision, the valley's work shifted to repair. The burnt straw was cleared. Maggie and Thomas rebuilt their outbuilding with planks borrowed from neighbors. People bartered labor instead of coin, a morning's work on a roof for a winter's worth of eggs. It's the kind of economics that binds lives rather than separates them. In the middle of that season of repair, something tender and simple happened between Rowan and Clara. It did not descend as a confession or a melodramatic promise. It came as shared labor does, quiet and intentional. Rowan taught Clara the method of mending a broken latch without raising the voice. She taught him how to fold a shirt so the child's small arms would not be tangled by mourning. They began to keep time together, roster, supper, watch, and found that partnership was less thunder than an ache that dissolved with work. There were afternoons when they would sit by the spring and mend nets for the coop, the child's laughter smoothing over them like the small run of waters. Rowan would talk about how he mended a broken plank to keep out the cold, and Clara would tell him about the time she had fixed a seam by lamplight and thought it would never hold. Both stories, in different ways, were about repair. That word, repair, became the sum of their life. Repair fences, repair trust, repair land. Their intimacy expressed itself in gestures. Rowan leaving a kettle to boil on Clara's stove so the tea was ready when she came to the barn. Clara hanging an extra blanket to dry on the ranch fence for Rowan's sleep. Once, in the harvest lull, they walked the ridge together in silence, hands brushing and then finding one another. A kiss came then, not a vow, but a reaffirmation, a small private act that recognized the work they'd both been doing. They married in a simple way that pleased the valley more than any grand ball might have. Thomas Duncan officiated with a steady voice, and Maggie baked a cake sweet enough to be scandalous by frontier standards. Neighbors brought a chair each and a tin cup. No preacher cried a sermon about love. Instead, the declaration was less used and more lived. Promises made in front of people whose lives were stitched to the land and to each other. Children were not instant. They arrived in their own time, as children do. June, who had been the size of a folded mitten on the day of the bull, grew, as children do, into a small person who wanted to be a part of every chore. Rowan watched her one morning at the stable, hair caught into a messy braid, concentrating on a wheelbarrow like it held the world's secrets. The feeling that rose in him when he saw her, pride, protectiveness, a softness that had not been there in the years after the river, took on a name: belonging. Time in the valley measured itself in chores and births and the way fences lean after a storm. Seasons rolled with their own gentle pedagogy. Rowan found himself less haunted by the river's memory and more occupied by the small demands of day. Not because the river had been forgotten, but because memories, when shared, lose some of their sharpness. Saying the name of the lost one, Rowan never did publicly, except once to Clara in the hush between shores, was like admitting the thing existed in both of them. She did not thrust a bomb upon him. She simply understood the geography of grief and walked it with him. Years later, when their house had a child's toys scattered like commas and the barn had a new hayloft, people visited and spoke of the valley's change. The spring ran in a different, bolder way because of the injunction. The fence lines had been mended and, in places, and set a new, stronger standard about property and neighborliness. Dawson's name still had weight, but less so. His hands were forced into a small but necessary humility, tribute not paid in money, but in acquiescence to common law and to the inconvenient fact of neighbors. Of course, life in the valley was not a patched painting of perfect calm. People argued, cows fell sick, and storms still toppled trees. But the tone had shifted. The default was not to sell to the first man with a ledger or to let fear be a currency. Instead, when someone came knocking with a handsome offer, the homesteader would buy a week to think and a second neighbor's counsel before accepting. They had learned the value of holding on until the law could sort greed from necessity. Rowan and Clara raised their children in that ethic. June learned to tie a knot and then the slow, kinder art of listening to a neighbor's problem until it simplified. She grew into a girl who could ride and sew and stand in a line of testimony without being frightened. The children of the valley, Rowans and others, learned early that courage often looks like constancy rather than drama. There were occasional reminders of the dark times. Garrett's name would come up in tavern talk, pronounced like someone else's bad weather. Dawson's ache for water would appear in long letters he tried to send to old friends. He would sign them with the kind of regret that's familiar to any man who has piloted his pride before reason. There was no need for revenge. The valley's answer had not been to shame, but to set a precedent that would help the next homesteader who would face a ledger in place of a neighborly hand. A decade after the day the bull had gone wild, the valley held a fair again. It was smaller in some ways and larger in others, because the people who came now knew the price of being part of a place. Wooden signs announced the events. There were pies to be bought, sewing contests, knucklebone tosses for the children, and a ring for riding that would not be used to test a mother's nerve. The stands were set back a little farther, fences reinforced as modest precautions. Clara sat in those stands with June, now a young woman whose small hand rested upon her mother's knee. The bonnet that had once sailed into the sky had been sewn into a quilt, and the quilt lay folded across Clara's lap like an old map. The sight of it made Rowan feel kin to a shore he'd come to know well, pieces of the past sewn into uses for the future. When a young bull in the ring tossed its head and the crowd gave a small chuckle rather than a gasp, Rowan's hand went to Clara's. The reflex of a man who had once moved into a field of danger remained, but the way he moved now was different, less a single act of salvation than a life lived that had become a constant of small reconciliations. They watched the animal until it calmed, then turned to one another and laughed in the kind of easy way people do when what once seemed sharp has been softened by time and tending. At the edge of the fair, as the afternoon leaned toward gold, a rider came up the lane with a slow gait. It was Marshal Briggs, older now, his ledger thicker and his smile more an acceptance than an astonishment. He tipped his hat to the couple and told a story he had been saving. A town judge from the city had read the valley's case in a recent conference as an example of how community and law can do what money cannot. The remark pleased the valley because it recognized the worth of record and voice. Rowan looked at the people who had been his neighbors in the dark of nights and in the hush of testimony. He saw Thomas Duncan, whose hair had silvered like a field of frost; Maggie, whose hands never stopped being on the move; Santos, sitting patient and unassuming near the fence with a small dog asleep on his boot. He saw Dawson at the far end, a man with respectable clothing and a scarred pride, speaking less loudly and with more reserve than before. Clara leaned her head against Rowan's shoulder. "You remember the day?" she said softly. She nodded toward the ring where a child was being taught to rope, and a woman beside him showed the way to feed a horse a little gentler than in the old days. "I do," he answered. "I remember nearly all of it. I remember the way the sun cut the benches in half, and how quiet it felt when she finally stopped crying. June waved at a neighbor and then ran off with a ribbon in her hair. Rowan touched the quilt on Clara's lap where the old bonnet's fabric lived now, woven into something that had found new life. He thought of the river and the way grief once occupied the center of his memory with such force that no other thing could breathe. He thought how that grief had been a reason to act, and how action had become something else entirely, a life. The valley, for all its smallness, kept a ledger too, an internal list of who did what when trouble arrived. That ledger did not fit neatly into a court record, but it informed the way people looked at one another. They gave each other the benefit of trust and expected an equal measure of return. There were times, quiet evenings, when Rowan and Clara would sit on their porch and watch the stars move as if on a slow, precise loom. They would speak of small things, a fence that needed mending, a neighbor's child who would be learning letters, a plan to plant an apple tree that would take years to fruit. These were not small sentiments. They were the scaffolding of a life that had been rebuilt not by grand gestures only, but by innumerable small acts that added themselves one upon another. They taught their children what to do when a person came to the gate demanding more than kindness allowed. The lessons were practical. Go get the neighbor, speak to the law, keep records. They taught the children that courage was often a steady hand on a latch and not always a horse at the ridge. They taught service as a form of love, and love as a form of work. On a late spring day, years after the bull charged and a man rode into danger, Clara and Rowan took their family back to the fairgrounds. The stands had been rebuilt and were painted fresh. A child fussed over the quilt, picking at a seam with a force of curiosity and ownership that made Rowan smile. They walked down together to the edge of the ring where the bench had once been flimsy and dangerous. The space where the rescue had happened was now shaded by a small tree where the wind liked to gather. Rowan knelt and adjusted June's braid, then looked up at Clara. There was no need for grand speech. Their lives had been their testimony. "We were given an odd beginning," he said quietly. Clara smiled in a way that acknowledged the truth of both past and present. "Odd and lucky," she answered. "Lives don't always need a thunderclap. Sometimes they need hands, steady hands. Sometimes they need someone to stand in front of a bull." They sat on the bench, family breathing around them, and watched children play. A young father, 2 benches over, told his boy a story of a man who rode into danger and a woman who would not give up her land. The story was told plainly, without embellishment, and with pride in the telling. Rowan found, in the sound of those words, a peace that did not erase loss, but made it part of a larger account. Before they left the fairground, Rowan rose and did what men in that valley had always done when a moment deserved it. He walked to the ring's edge where the old bonnet's patch on the quilt could be seen and laid his hand on the wood. It was a private gesture, a small shrine of memory and of thanks. He did not pray aloud. He did not have to. The place, the child, the woman who had knelt at his side in a barn and in a courtroom, these were his answer. Clara took his hand and squeezed it, a tactile promise that had been formed through years of repair and of ordinary fidelity. "We did well," she said. He let himself believe it. They had done what they could with what they'd been given, guarded a child in a moment of wildness, stiffened the valley's back when intimidation came, turned to law and testimony as instruments of justice, and then built a life from repairable pieces. That was the form their love had taken, quiet, sturdy, shaped by the necessity of everyday things. Years on, children who were once small would bring grandchildren to sit on the same bench and point to the place where the bonnet had once been blown away. The story would be told and retold not as a legend of a single hero, but as a ledger of many hands and a steady law. "He rode in," grandchildren would hear. "He stood there, but we all stood with him. When Rowan's hair had silver threads and Clara's hands showed the map of a life in small scratches and calluses, they would sometimes go to the ridge and watch late light fold the valley. The memory of the bull would be a thing that belonged to other people now, but its lessons remained. Courage must be paired with restraint. Law must be given a record. Community must be willing to witness. On one such evening, Rowan told June, now a woman with knowledge of stitches and market days, how in the first moments it had been only reflex. "I saw a small hand and I simply moved," he said. "You learn the motion when you've lost people. You either let fear teach you to retreat, or you let it teach you to step in. I chose the harder lesson then." June listened as if the words themselves were seeds, and she asked, as children do when they want to build their world with the same tools, "Did you ever regret it?" Rowan thought of the river and of the child he'd carried then, and of the life that had unspooled, mending and testifying and loving. "No," he said at last, "not the choice, only the memory that made me move. I carry both. One makes me careful, the other makes me kind." It's an odd way to finish a story, not with heroism, but with the inventory of what one keeps. They kept quilts and legal papers and stories. They kept friendships and a line of people who would, if need be, stand in the light of a lantern and name what they'd seen. They kept the knowledge that one small act, courage mixed with restraint, had been the beginning of a life they all shared. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who believes that small, steady courage and community testimony can change a life.